All trumpets come with valve slides. And for students, those are going to be used in varying degrees to adjust intonation in real time as the instrument's played. For professional instruments, they're going to come with slides that are fit and should be moving freely enough for the professional players to adjust intonation, because that's going to be of a greater concern to most professionals. Often when we get an instrument in the shop, the slides may not work as well as they can, and it's going to be for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's going to be corrosion buildup, sometimes it's going to be a dent in the tubes, sometimes it's going to be misalignment. And what we're going to talk about today is how to deal with misaligned valve slides that are not functioning very well. Okay? Just for recalling, remember that the space between an inner slide and its outer slide mate is roughly 1/1000th of an inch. And on professional instruments where the fit tolerances are much greater, typically what's going to happen is they're going to draw this tubing, and it's going to be drawn sized to the point where it's a fairly tight fit, and then this is going to be hand lapped to work. And a good indication of the fit tolerance is when you put a inner slide into its outer slide tube on a trumpet, and you try to move that. So right now I'm moving it up and down to feel for slop. On many professional level instruments, you're not going to feel any or very little slop in those tubes, which speaks to the challenges when these slide tubes are misaligned with one another. Okay. So the other thing that we need to keep in mind is that there are two parallels that we need to mind in order for this slide to work perfectly. The slide and the tubes on the instrument have to be dead parallel on span, and they have to be dead parallel in the side plane. If we can get those things to be dead parallel in both of those planes, then everything should work well. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start from just inspections. When you're working with a valve slide, instead of manipulating it at the finger hook or at the finger ring on the third slide, one thing especially when you're inspecting, is notice that we're coming back here from the crook. And the reason we're doing it this way is we talked about slides that are a bit tight, but you're going to have slides that are loose. And some of these on professional instruments are so loose that when you manipulate the finger hook, with this dry, because we do all of our work dry, when you manipulate the finger hook, it creates a canting, and the slide actually cocks and gets stuck. So you want to make certain that all of your inspections are from the crook side. Same thing when you're working with the third slide. Okay, you're always going to check it like this, not from that perspective. Okay? What knocks slide out of alignment is going to be the player handling the instrument, right? So many players will do chem flushes at home. They'll take out their slides, they put the instrument in the bathtub or whatever, they handle the slide, and next thing you know, they grab it. And again, when we're talking about 1/1000th of an inch space and less between the inner and outer slide tubes, the next thing you know, just a little bit of squeezing on the slide itself can create a problem. The other thing that can happen is a bent bell can knock a slide out of alignment. On the third slide, a misaligned chassis, a slide gets dropped, the crook gets dented. Same thing here. Then the span starts to change, or the side plane starts to change, where we end up with skew, which is just a misparallel in the side plane. That's how we define that. So a number of things can happen to knock a slide out of functionality for a player. The other thing that you're going to find too is that they come from the factory misaligned. And with some professional instruments, you might find you do a chem flush, the slides aren't right. We typically align them as part of the job. Okay? If the player doesn't care, we certainly don't do it. But in practice, we typically do it. A process map is a really good thing to work from with this particular task, because there's a lot of if-ands with this. So the one thing that we start with clean tubes, okay? And notice it says it works with clean, dry tubes throughout. So we don't lubricate the slide tubes. They have to work freely without any lube, okay? And so let's just take a look at that. In this instance, this instrument's been through a chem flush, and what I want to make certain is that there's no slag from the chem flush, and with a little bit of solvent on my cleaning rod, I'm going to go in and make certain that these tubes are perfectly good to go. And don't forget to wipe off the inner slide tubes as well. And let's assume that this first valve slide is misaligned. We're going to talk about thirds in a little bit. So now everything is clean and bone dry. All right? And just know too that as you're working a slide to get it aligned, that constant motion of checking can create an abrasion goo. So expect to wipe out your slides quite often during the process. Now let's go back to our process map. The next thing it says, hang on, there we go, and there's a question mark here. It says prep bearing surfaces with mild abrasives. So what's meant there is some shop, throughout use, you can see here that there are some minor scratches here on the tubes that are going the wrong way, they're going up and down as opposed to lengthwise down the tube, it's following the action of the tube itself. Some shops will like to do a prep on these, not unlike what people would do coming out of a chem flush. Some will use, let's go see what this says. Some will use, to prep tubes, ultrafine grit sandpapers, and what we recommend is 1000 grit and up. The Miracle Cloth is a really nice option for you, right? And that works well for prepping a tube. But with whatever you use, Scotch-Brite pads is another option. Crocus cloth is another thing shops will do. For me personally, that's a little bit abrasive. One other suggestion is if you're going to use any abrasive on the tube, ensure that you're following the grain pattern or the motion of the tube, so that you can see here that there's grain following the tube lengthwise. Make certain that if you're going to strap this, that you do your strapping, but then follow the grain back so that the slide doesn't have any resistance to that motion, because if you have grain going across, right, lubrication is going to get caught in that, and it's going to slow the slide down, pardon me. Okay? So in this instance, these tubes are prepped, the slide is misaligned, everything is clean, and we're good to go. So let's just go through a checklist now. So you've prepped the bearing surfaces, right? And everything is back to being clean and dry. Make certain if you do any type of tube prep to ensure that the tubes are back to being clean and dry. So now the question is each tube set running freely? And what we're talking about with tube sets running freely is when I put just one tube in, one slide in with its mated outer, okay, is it completely frictionless. And because the slide is in its set position, okay, often the habit is to check it perhaps at 90 degrees. And what we suggest is when you're inspecting your tubes, go all the way around with special attention to 180 degrees to where the slide actually is set to work. Because often a problem that might be here, right, is going to manifest itself 180 degrees, but not necessarily at 90. So make certain that you're checking all the way around, particularly at that 180 degree spot. And the rule is, on a professional instrument, is this tube should simply release. it should fall right out. Okay? And when we're working with a slide, when the outcome of this should be that when here's X amount of resistance, here's this resistance. When I put the slide together, it should be the sum of the resistance of each tube put together. Okay, so that's the rule. So if it's free here, and it's free here, and it's not free here, then something is wrong. Okay, so if my slides are free, then I can proceed with the alignment. But let's assume that they aren't. So some things that you can do. So now we're going to start inspecting. So is each tube set running freely? Let's say they aren't. First thing we're going to do is make certain there are no dents. Okay, so inspect for dents in each tube, and that includes the inner slides as well as the outers. Remove dents if so. In your inspections, make certain that you're sighting the tubes in that light and looking for any aberrations to those surfaces. And the reason you want to inspect both inners and outers is sometimes a slide tube gets dropped, the edge of the tube gets dented, and we need to deal with that because a dented tube edge often is a displaced tube edge, and you want to fix that. We're not going to go into slide repair with this particular demo because we're assuming that you know how to fix tubes. So let's assume that the tubes are dent free, but there's still a little bit of resistance here. Something isn't quite right. Okay, the tubes aren't falling freely. Is the tube end flared or distorted? You know, we talked about distortion from being dropped, but in some shops, if this slide is excessively loose, they might take a mouthpiece or some sort of tool and flare the edge of the tube to take up slop. And sometimes when that happens, that it makes it much more difficult to align that slide. So if the tube edge is flared, and you're going to be able to discern that just by running your fingers very lightly up the tube wall, and then when it hits the edge, you're going to perceive if there's a change in dimension. Now obviously if the outer tube wall is flared, that's a little bit different story. It's not as much of a concern. And it's also going to be less likely on a slide tube that's attached to the casing. But it's good to inspect all the way around. The next thing you want to check is, are you sure that the tubes are clean? And one reason for this is if you're doing a chem flush and these slide tubes are especially corroded, they may appear good on the inner slides, but inside the outers, always remember that there's corrosion inside. Always inspect to ensure that you've got all the corrosion out. Okay? One thing, well, and you can do that with a borescope, but you can also just shine your flashlight out of there. So in other words, make certain the tubes are clean. One way to kind of inspect is drop a little bit of oil here on the inners, and then work the outer in, wipe it out, and if there's excessive debris, you know that there's something that needs to be addressed back in the chem flush. You know what, I'm going to stay here for a moment because I want to talk a little bit about something that happens at the factory. When these slides are assembled, now I'm off the process map, but you can add this. Sometimes when slides are assembled, they'll solder the crooks in, and a little bit of solder bleeds into the outer slide tube. And it's going to show when you put the individual tube in and you slide it up, and there's just a little bit of a bite here. So you want to inspect not just the edge of the ferrule to make certain there's not a solder bleed that's biting on the outer slide tube as it comes in, but you also want to check back here. And you might have a visual check, which is fine. This is a tool that Faury sells, and it's a interior tube solder scraper. What you can do is, let's say that you sight in here and you're thinking, there might be a little bit of solder. What you can do is you can rest the tool against the tube wall, and obviously profile, you can see there's a cutter, and go right up against that tube, slide it down so that the edge of the tool, right, is rubbing against the tube wall. and it will cut any solder out of its path. And I added that because if you look right here, you can see that there was a little dot of solder that was left behind when this slide was assembled. And sure enough, there was a little bit of a bite here. And I used that tube scraper to remove any of that solder, and now this slide is ready to go. Now, because I ran a tool inside that tube, I need to go in and clean that out. Because again, clean and dry tubes. So that takes care of that. Now let's see what else we got here. What else might be inhibiting that slide from running freely? And it could be, is there a spot that slows or grabs? And of course, you're going to recheck for corrosion and dents, right? If good to go, consider rounding the outer tube at that spot with an expander. And here's what I'm talking about with that. When a tube is drawn over a mandrel, it's not always dead round with itself. So it might be straight, but there might be a little errancy just in the roundness of the tube. And it might show up as when I get here, when I'm working this slide right here at the base, there's something a little bit funky going on, like there's a little bit of a bite. That out of roundness might have been exacerbated by when it was soldered, because when solder cools, there's always a little bit of warping that can occur. Okay, the solder joint shrinks a little bit, and what that can do is just pull that slide a little bit out of round. This is where you can spot burnish with an expander. And you know this, but make sure that you're using an expander that's appropriate to the size of the tube. In this instance, this is the medium-sized Frise, and it's the extra long one because that's what I got out of the drawer. And you can put that inside the outer tube, set it to its base. In this instance, I'm thinking my issue is right here at the base. I can bring that expander up to tension, and so now I know it's grabbing on the wall, not very much though, and then 5 minutes on the clock, and I can just very lightly burnish that area. And you can put a little bit of oil to act as your burnisher, slide or lubricant, or slide cream, or if your expanders are in good shape, you can do it dry. That's really up to you. But now that I've had a tool in there, I need to go in and clean that out. So if you're thinking that a tube just needs to be rounded, the expander is going to go in and simply true up the tube. It's pretty rare, unless the tube is especially soft, that the expander is going to explode the tube. Okay? Is it possible? Of course it is. But in this instance, when we went up to snug, 5 minutes on the clock, that is sufficient pressure often to round a tube. You might have to go 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, it's likely something else is wrong, like a dent or something else needs to be addressed, solder or whatever. The final question is the tube set too tight? This is rare, but it does happen. And this is where you have some choices. Sometimes people will strap the tube to get it to fit. Some will lap. Some will do both. My feeling about it is I don't want to lap if I don't have to. If I am going to lap, I'm going to use the Frise L58 or equivalent, which is 1,000 grit garnet, or 1,200 grit, or toothpaste, right? Because Pepsodent toothpaste is a good lapping compound. And then we'll do some fitting on the slide. The reason lapping is last because too often, shops will lap a slide tube that has a dent in it. Well, all you're doing is creating excess space, creating leaks to address a problem that should be addressed through proper repair techniques. I don't want to make this tube any looser than it needs to be to function. Okay? If I create leaks, then it's a disservice to the customer. The other thing is lapping. If you're going to lap, it's time consuming because the act of lapping itself is not that much, but the cleanup is where your time gets eaten up. So as a last resort, you can lap that tube, but make certain that all of the other bases are covered. So now we're at a point where we know the individual tubes are fantastic. There's no obstruction to this slide working. And by fantastic, we know that that means that when I put the slide in, I turn the instrument upside down and let's give it a little bop, and the slide just drops. And what we're finding is that when I put this slide together, it's not quite right, which means that if our tubes are good, then there's a problem with the alignment of the slide, with the parallels. Okay? So before I go nuts with measuring, one thing that I typically do, and let's go back to that process map. So are the individual tubes running freely? Yep, they are, right? And here's the question. Is there another slide on the instrument with the same crook span that is in proper alignment? So let's talk about that for a second. Obviously there are 2 valve slides on here, and these valve slides are built, whoops, with the same crooks. Okay? So the span of this crook is the same as the span of that crook. Which means that if this is not working and this working slide might help me get this not working slide in a place where it will work well. So, and it's not an always, but sometimes this is helpful. In this instance, this slide's working okay, and it's only okay. Make sure it's dry because I don't want to mess up what I just did. Yeah, it is. Good. If I fit my not so good first slide to my working well third slide, is that going to give me a clue as to what the problem is? And in this instance, it might be. Because in this instance, right, my first slide, notice I've got the water key vented. In this instance, when I put this on, it starts to bite. Now, a challenge with this horn is that I can tell you for sure that even though this was built on the same crook, the span of this is just a couple thousandths different than the span of this. Okay, but let's say I want to make this first slide work to the third. What you can do is put one slide in. Okay, and the reason the first slide is the reason I'm confident that the first slide is out is because the third slide is working, and this slide has no brace. Typically, a brace slide, if it's working well, it's in a place where it's going to be more rigid and not be as prone to being messed up. So in this instance, I can put this together and I can just start examining. If I put one tube in, lay the other tube up against it. Be mindful of a flared tube, because sometimes you'll think that there's a problem when there really isn't. It's just a flared tube. And what I'm looking for is, do these two slide tubes align together? The second thing I can do is inspect for span, and you can do that right out of the gate, where when the first slide starts, how is that entering its outer tube? And we're going to do that on the body tubes. I can also use this good slide to inspect the chassis tubes, right? The tubes connected to the valve casing. And I can put that on and I can say, oh, well, these tubes are off compared to that third. And what I can do is start manipulating these to match. Typically though, we fix this first and then use that to adjust the chassis tubes. So we're going to get one of these working. So you can use this to help you out. But let's set this aside, because I know that it's not going to apply for this particular instrument. So I want a known quantity. That's really the key. If I can get this confidently in parallel in both planes, span and side plane, if I can get that confidently parallel, then I can use that to get these confidently in parallel, and then with luck and skill, then I can get these things to be dead perfect. Okay? So let's talk about how to do that. Let's go back to our process map. So, is there a slide with the same crook span and proper alignment? We already dispatched with that, right? Use the working slide to assist with aligning the misaligned slide. But let's say you don't have that. So what we're going to do is we're going to check the span and adjust to parallel. And what you see here are options. One is going to be a caliper to help you. The other is a thickness or feeler gauge set that you purchase with your tool blocks. Another is using an Allen wrench, and the other is a small hole gauge. If you're going to use the caliper, clear my field here. The caliper is terrific when you want to inspect the parallels of like a main tuning slide or a wide span slide. Oh, and this one's off. Okay. This one's towing in a little bit. Okay. And you can do that by feel. You can also do that numerically, right? So the span at the edge of the tube is, let's do that again. Let's get some actual numbers. This will be germane to this, don't worry. So the span out here is that, 2.129. The span here, 2.132, so we're about 3/1000ths off. So this is towing in 3/1000ths of an inch. The nice part about using the caliper is that the machining of it makes it so that it will rest beautifully on these tubes so that I can inspect my parallels and not worry about lifting off. If we were to try to apply that to this valve slide tube, I need to make certain that this finger ring is out of the way. And I can bring this in, and now this is where things get clunky. I can rest that on the tubes, and then I can open my jaws, and I typically open them just slightly crooked. Okay, and then when I swing that off of the pivot, the front jaw pivot, then I get a sense of my span, right? And then I can apply that to the other end. The challenge with the valve slide is that this is so narrow and they're so fussy, that this says that it's parallel, and it likely is, but often the caliper is a little bit clumsy for me. Okay, you might find that it works well. And of course, if this is out of span, you simply flex and adjust it to where you need it to be. Okay, but let's say you don't like using the caliper. You want to use something else. This feeler gauge set is really terrific for this job because, again, I said the caliper is a little bit clunky. If you put yourself a white background and you stack these gauges so that you're filling the space between the two tubes, you can put that in there. Now what I do is I will press down on the far end to make certain that those gauges are stacked tightly. You can see if these tubes are parallel. Okay. Now a challenge with doing this is, remember we talked about flared tubes? If this is flared at all on the edge, it's going to give you a misread. So make certain you take that out of the equation. If the tube is flared, you might want to switch to a different method like the caliper. Okay. But I go to this first, and it lets me work really quickly. So what I'm looking for now is, let me get this right, here we go, is there equal space between the stacked gauges and the inner slide tube. And I can get that really close so that I see just a sliver of white space behind there. Okay. All right. So the feeler gauge or the thickness gauges are really nice for that purpose. Another tool that you can use, and this preceded our figuring out that we could use those feeler gauges, is to lay a good hex wrench down on the tube. Again, the non-flared tube, and you can choose a wrench size that fills that space and get a sense of, okay, is this cheating in or is it cheating out? And let me show you what this might look like. There, I just knocked it out of alignment. And you can see here, hopefully you can see. Whoops, hang on. There we go. There we go. You can see that those tubes are not parallel. That you can see that it's towing in on the end there. Okay. There was a little hitch with the video, and we lost the footage on using small hole gauges to check for parallel with your valve slides. And small hole gauges look like this, and they're great in band instrument repair for measuring things like tone hole diameters, right, when we're doing tone hole inserts or replacements. What you're going to do, the way this works, is you're going to find the small hole gauge that most closely, oops, not that one, most closely fits the span but is not too big. And there's an end nut here on the small hole gauge that pulls that pin back and spreads the gauge. And the way this works is you put the gauge inside, and this requires you, and I'm going to move my finger so you can see it, but this requires you to be very, very accurate with how you're holding it and moving it in and out of the span of the slide. So the way you can do this is, so now that gauge is fitting in just there. I mean, I have to push it just a little bit. Let me back that off a little bit more to where it just touches in the back. And then you want to feel that same touch in the front. And in this instance, this slide is towing in just a little bit. And by towing in, I mean the span out here is narrower than the span here. Now, the challenge with the small hole gauge is how you handle it, because I can rotate it and it's wrong. I can change the angle and it's wrong. So to use this tool accurately, it really requires you to be consistent with how you're handling the tool. Okay, so this is a standard small hole gauge. These ball-end small hole gauges are also very nice. If I were to use small hole gauges, and I used them years ago, I don't anymore. I really rely on the feeler / thickness gauges and calipers if I'm trying to measure slide tube span. So, but small hole gauges, we've taught it in the past, and you might be around in shops that still use them. And there's nothing wrong with it, but just know that it's really dependent on the operator to get a good feel for making these work. Okay, so that's the small hole gauges. And in this instance, instead of trying to flex that outward, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to something that's rigid. And that's going to be the instrument itself. So what we can do is put the inner slide into the lower, inner into the lower outer. And then I can flex up and always flex. And you can spread that out. Notice too that I have a reference point. Here's the edge of the outer, here's the edge of the upper inner, and you can use that to check for parallels as well. And you can flex that slide and then go back to your inspections. And I still like to use these gauges because it does give me a sense of, okay, that looks very, very good now because I flexed it back from where I created the error. So to take care of span, again, we're trying to get a known to adjust, to check and adjust your span. You can use these techniques. So my span is good. Now what I'm looking for is in the side plane, check for skew and adjust side plane to parallel. When you're inspecting for skew, again, you need some sort of background. I'm going to zoom in on this. There we go. A real simple thing that you can do is, notice here, here's the edge of the inner, here's the edge of the upper outer. And if you get these close together, when I align the edge of the slide tube to the edge of the ferrule so that it's not wonky like that. So I've got those aligned, and then you can see here that this is slightly out of parallel in the side plane. Okay, notice that? So when I'm looking at edge to edge, I can see X amount of space here, but then notice that it's increased over here. So these tubes are crossed like that in that side plane. Now, if I need to adjust that, it's going to be very difficult to do that in my hand. I can put this in the outer slide, right? Go back to the lower inner, to the lower outer, and I can flex, right? Just like that. That's kind of clunky. But I can use, oops, let's get that slide out of the way. But I can use my third valve slide to adjust that. Let me move that up a little bit. And I'm going to block against the crook, and I'm actually going to make certain that my flexing is in that plane, because I don't want to do it at an odd angle. I want to do it so that I'm visually watching that slide move to where it should be. And then I can bring it back out again, out of the pool, and I can check again. Nope, not quite. And I can go back and I can manipulate that again. Block against the crook, flex, until that slide is showing parallel in the side. Oh, hooray for our side, in the side plane. Okay, so now I have a known. My span is good, my side plane should be good, no skew. And the next thing I can do now is, let's go to the chassis tubes. The first thing I'll do is I'll inspect side plane. Now this is where, since this is a known, right, I should be able to rest that up against that edge and determine, let's put a little white space there. See how that's going together? So if this is skewed compared to that, then I know that I can manipulate the tube that's on the chassis. And again, if I'm going to do that, this is important to me, is don't cross planes. So I'm not going to lay it down and lift it up. I'm going to put it so that visually I have one tube over top another, my thumb comes underneath, and I'm going to flex that so that it's only moving in that plane and not screwing up the parallels in the parallel span. Okay? The next thing I'm going to do, again, because this I'm thinking is pretty good, it's a known, right? The other thing I'm going to do now is to check for span. I'm going to put this together, and notice the upper slide tube is going to bite first, right? Because the way they're made, one tube is going to start first. Excuse me, this is clumsy. And I'm watching how that enters, and I'm looking for equal space all the way around this lower tube. So sometimes when you're checking for parallel, that's a really good check. Okay? And in this instance, right, this slide is, it's still not quite right, but we're going to get that. All right? So now that this is a known, we can start adjusting this accordingly. What I did, well, I didn't do anything, but so one thing that I'm doing right now is, notice here, and I'm going to put a light behind here because light is your best friend. Here's my leak light, and you can see, look at that right there. Remember, we've got that slide parallel in the side plane, but look here. You can see that I've got contact here on the end and then space down here. Now be mindful, again, that thing about don't be gassed by a flared tube. In this instance, the tube isn't flared. Okay? Even if it were flared and it were contacting here, you would still see that angle where there's error there in the parallels. But with this light back here, and use light, we want to get done with this job. We don't want to be doing this all day. You can see that I need to adjust this upper inner slide tube that's attached to the chassis. And actually you can see here that there's an error there too with the, when you put edge to edge. We can flex that into parallel. And I'm going to go back. Close, but not good enough. So again, you can check, again, just a little bit more. And I'd rather take my time. And again, don't cross the planes. When you're doing this, make certain that you're viewing so that you don't see the upper tube. And then that this pressure here, and notice that I'm using the slide itself. I'm not changing that slide by virtue of how I'm handling it at the crook. If I were out here pushing down on the edge of the tube, it would be a different story. Oops, hang on, let's go back and check. Not bad. Just a little bit more, and I think we're going to be in pretty good shape. So now we can start inspecting with the slide together. And this slide has improved markedly. It's not quite there yet though. So let's go through our flow chart. Okay. Check for skew and adjust side plane to parallel. Visually sighting tube edges or using a working slide to assist in determining parallel. We showed that with the third valve slide. Am I done? Well, in this instance, it got a ton better, but nope, I'm not done. We missed something. And it's likely not way up here at the start, right? Because each tube is still running freely, right? This has all been done. It's somewhere here in the alignment, either parallel span or parallel in the side plane. Okay? So let's go back, but before we do that, make certain that your tubes are clean. So one more time with our cleaner, and if the rag is dirty, don't send a dirty rag inside a horn, because it just transfers dirt. Look at that, I just messed up my paper. Let's get those tubes dead on clean, and don't forget to do the inner slides. For your solvent, you can use denatured alcohol. Tubes are still fine individually. And together, they're not quite there. So now I have to make a decision. Which way am I going to go with this? So let's do this. Let's go back to that side plane, because often it's that side plane is just a little bit of a stinker. And let's just double check. Make sure we didn't miss something. Now, if the tubes are loose, you're not always going to get the best read because there's slop in the upper tube. In this instance, these tubes are still pretty tight, so we're able to get a good read. I think I'm going to go down a little bit more in the side plane here. And again, don't cross planes. I emphasize that because I did that for years and I really suffered because of it. And did it get better? Ooh, it did. Let's keep going, right? If you're successful, keep going until you're not. And slide's getting a little bit better. And, oh, I'm on a roll. Can't stay in that plane. Heard that one enough. And it got a little bit worse. So now I'm just going to flex that back to where it was, because now I know that in the side plane I've exhausted what I can do. So now let's look at span. So because this is attached to the upper tube, let's just manipulate that a little bit. Let's just push that outward a little bit. So increase the span on the chassis tubes, and let's see if that gets better. Oh, yes. And let's go a little bit more. Boop, boop, boop. And this is so subtle, because remember, there's 1/1000th of an inch between the inner and outer slide tubes, and then you're asking 2 sets of those to run together well, which means that if you're off by 1/2,000th, this slide's not going to do what it's supposed to do. But that's awfully good, except that I don't like it. I'm going to go a little bit more. I'm going to turn off that. Well, yeah, let's turn off that light. There we go. A little bit in the side plane. Ah, that's feeling better yet. And when I do this, sometimes you're going to get a clue as to what the issues are. And what I mean by that is I'm opening the span here on the body, okay? As you do this, sometimes you're going to notice that the slide's working okay, but then you might want to come and just do a little bit of manipulating here on the slide itself. And in this instance, all I did was bring this in a little bit, and that slide is absolutely good to go. And again, notice my inspection is to grab the crook and not do the whole thumb hook thing. Because again, if the slided tubes are loose, it's just going to cock and get stuck on the cant of that. Okay? So in this instance, that's that resistance. That's that resistance. I put it together, and it's the same. It's the sum of those two things. I don't need to lap. I don't need to strap this. I'm not compensating with lapping compound for an error, in the parallels of these tubes. So in this instance, we've won. But let's go to this third slide. On this third slide, it's a braced assembly. And let's say that it's not right. So let's say in the side plane, you notice there's a skew, or in your inspections, which is going to be clumsy because of that stop ring. Let's say you're using your caliper and you notice, well, there's a little bit of error here, okay, in that span. The fact that this is braced becomes a bit of a problem, but not as much as you'd think. Y'all made that slide tube mandrel, and you can use this, oops, I'm looking through a camera. You can use that slide tube mandrel to do some minor adjustments. Even though that's braced, you can still flex in the side plane. But here's what's cool. Let's say that brace is really, really strong, like on this Yamaha. That's pretty substantial because it's a solid brace. What you can do is you can put your slide tube mandrel in, and I want to manipulate that to go in the side plane to move a little bit. You can tap that, and at this solder joint, it will do a little bit of a jog so that you can get your third valve slide that's braced in the position that you want. Same thing with the span. If I need to close the span, I can just do this. I can just grab it and close it, and it will manipulate right here at the solder joint. On a Bach where you got those double braces, the nature of those braces is such that they will expand and contract. Okay, I'm going to come back to a Bach in a minute. But let's say I need to open the span, which is really common. What you do is you hold, I'm going to pan it back a little bit here. Oops, wrong way. You hold the tube, the upper tube. You put the mandrel in the lower, and you tap just like that. And so let me do this so that you can see it. Just like that. And what happens is, because you're holding the upper tube, it's going to pivot right at that point. And so you can adjust a braced assembly somewhat. I mean, not a ton, but often enough to, it got better. Often enough to where you can improve the performance of this markedly, okay? And of course, there's a point of no return, right? There's a point where you simply have to rebuild the slide, but that's the exception and not the rule. So two things I want to talk about. One, on a box strat, and I don't have one here, but you're familiar enough with those. On a box strat, there's a water slide, correct? There's a water slide and then two braces. When you're adjusting the third valve slide on a box Stradivarius, you always do your adjustments with the water slide in. Often what happens is you get the slide working, if you don't have the water slide in, you get it working perfectly, you put the water slide in and everything gets screwed up. Because that slide is putting pressure on those braces and it's changing those parallels enough to jam the slide. The last thing we want to talk about, because we're way into this. The last thing we want to talk about is with brass tubes in particular. So when you have brass on brass tubing, sometimes you're doing a series of inspections. So in this instance, I'm working, and all of a sudden, something happens where this slide jams up. And what you can do is, what's happening, and again, this happens with brass on brass tubes that you're checking dry. A little ball of brass actually gets, the tube gets galled. And what we mean by galled is a trench gets cut into the tube. And it's because something got loose and carved a little trench, and you'll notice that there's a little ball on the surface of the tube. And that happens again, like I said, with brass on brass. You can take, I didn't bring my scraper. You can take a triangular scraper and just knock that little ball off of there. Now the challenge is if you have a ball on the inner tube here or here, there's going to be a corresponding ball inside the outer tube. And that's where that Fries tube scraper comes in handy. So you can go in and then you can cut out any little ball in there. Okay? So that's like, for lack of a better term, it's just a little ball that forms through the tube being galled as you're working it. And it's because brass is a softer material. Nickel silver, and if you have brass against nickel silver, it's really less common. So I'm thinking I'm in pretty good shape. And what I'm going to do is, with a clean cloth, let's go in and clean everything out one last time. See? Because nothing means nothing unless it's clean. So everything gets cleaned and then gets a final inspection. Sometimes you can walk away and just let it kind of think about it for a little bit. In this instance, that is so good. There she goes. Now the third slide didn't work. It did improve, and I would need to do some more on this, but it's not ready to drop. Okay. All right. But this gives you a sense of what to do. So hopefully this process map is going to walk you through what you can do. All right? And just the main thing to emphasize is, don't lap or strap tubes looser to accommodate for a slide that is misaligned. It's unprofessional. You're adding leaks to the instrument, and it's just not the signature that you want. And once you align a few slides, you're going to get the hang of it. It doesn't take that long after you do a couple. The first might be frustrating, but you'll get it. The other thing too is, if you're working something and it's taken more than 5 minutes, go back to the inspections. And usually you miss, at least with me, usually I've missed something when I inspected the span, I didn't eye it quite as well as I could. So I'm going to go back and check that. Make certain that you're using white backgrounds. That's really critical, or lighted backgrounds. The same thing in the side plane. Make certain that you didn't miss something with the skew. All right, because it's going to be as little as 1/1000th of an inch variation that's going to slow that slide down. So it's a very, very accurate game that you're playing. When you're doing your final adjustments, you can measure your brains out, but it's going to be by feel and just by trial and error. Remember that I changed the side plane a little bit. It got better, it got better, it got better, then it got a little bit worse, so I knew to put it back where it was at its best. Then I adjusted the span because I still wasn't quite happy. It got better, got better, got better, got worse, then I put it back, and together we're in business. Okay? Thank you very much.